When a paper like the Washington Post carries this story, and when the New York Times claims that the evidence has been jointly gathered with FBI help, and that means the American system has helped, it could end up influencing international opinion. Countries like the Five Eye countries, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, countries in Europe, all of them could begin to believe that there is some truth to the story. Does that worry you? That people will give credibility because it's the Washington Post carrying the story?
I agree with you. And this story is not good for us. Our government should make every effort and as early as possible to squash this story. I agree with you that India's prestige, India's honor, or India's credibility will suffer because of this story. But I think there is no but about it. But it is not a good thing for us. The foreign minister should consider writing an article or talking to the New York Times people in Delhi or Washington Post people in Delhi. I think we should not just leave this at a lower level because it is a serious allegation and it is now being made too much of by the Canadians for their own reasons. But I think on the whole, I would agree with you that it would be a good idea for a foreign minister to respond in any manner that he deems appropriate.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. India-Canada relations seem to be in free fall, and we have no idea when they will bottom out or what could happen next. Meanwhile, the Washington Post has reported that in a secret meeting in Singapore on Saturday, Canada's national security advisor told Ajit Doval, India's NSA, that one of the possible accused is Home Minister Amit Shah. Separately, the New York Times has reported that America's FBI has cooperated with Canada's mounted police to help gather the evidence against India. For its part, India has accused Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of pandering to Sikh sentiments and vote bank politics. So what should we make of all of this? My guest is India's former permanent representative to the United Nations and author of Centers of Power, My Years in the Prime Minister's Office and Security Council, Chinmaya Gharekhan. Mr. Gharekhan, on Monday, that's yesterday, India expelled the Canadian chargé d'affaires and 5 other diplomats. In turn, Canada expelled the Indian ambassador and 5 other diplomats. Is the relationship between the two countries now in free fall where we don't know where it will bottom out?
It seems to be the kind of a free fall. Mr. Trudeau is in political trouble, electoral troubles at home. And so he is, I think, making this up in a big way for local domestic political reasons. India's response, I think, is proportionate because it was Canada with first sent back a persona non grata, our diplomats, and so it's only proper that India should retaliate in an appropriate manner.
Tell me, could the situation lead to a break in diplomatic relations? That hasn't happened as yet, but I presume we must be pretty close to it.
I don't think we are pretty close to it. We still have the missions there, all right. And if we have expelled only 6 Canadian diplomats, there are many, many more than that still in Delhi. And I don't think we have only 6 diplomats in Ottawa or in Canada. I'm sure we have more than that. So it is not a complete rupture in diplomatic relations.
So you're saying that the relationship is close to being in free fall, but you don't believe the relationship will rupture?
Yeah, I mean, it can get ruptured. I'm not saying it can never be. It can get ruptured, but for the moment, I think both sides would like to exercise some restraint.
Let's at this point, Mr. Gharekhan, look at some of the specific details that have appeared in the papers. Unnamed Canadian officials have told the Washington Post that Indian diplomats in America were ferreting out information and details on Sikh extremists in Canada, passing them on to Raw, who in turn was using the Lawrence Bishnoi team members in Canada to kill these Sikh extremists. In your eyes, is that a fantastical story or might it be credible?
It's a ridiculous story. The Canadians are uh, talking all this nonsense without a shred of evidence, as our people have said, and to accuse India of all those things, to accuse the Indian High Commissioner personally of being involved and to want to interview him. This is absolutely not acceptable.
You say it's a ridiculous and unacceptable story, but it is very reminiscent of what America has alleged when they claim that a raw official, named by the Washington Post as Vikram Yadav, CC1 is what the Americans in their indictment called him, is responsible for hiring Nikhil Gupta to attempt to kill Panun. This is very similar to the American allegation. And as far as the American allegation is concerned, India's taken it very seriously. We are cooperating. A team has gone from India to America to cooperate today. Why then do we think that the Canadian allegation is ridiculous and unacceptable when the two are so similar?
Well, I'm going by what the Ministry of External Affairs has said in its statement or its press release. Our government has said that in spite of repeatedly asking Canadian government, they have not provided a shred of evidence to support their allegations. And I have no business to doubt what our government has said.
Let me point out what the Washington Post claims as of today. The paper claims that, and I'm quoting, Canadian officials have identified Home Minister Amit Shah as someone who authorized the intelligence gathering missions and attacks on Sikh separatists. That's pointing the finger at the second most important man in the country and someone who is extremely close to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. They are now pointing the finger directly at our Home Minister, according to the Washington Post.
Yeah, I read that, I noticed that, and I'll repeat what I said earlier, that this is a ridiculous allegation to make. They have, I think they are very much guided by the domestic voting bloc which they have of the Sikhs, and they want to. And Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, is not in a very comfortable position electoral wise. That's what I hear, and so I think he's overdoing this particular instance.
I hear
So,
what you say that this is a ridiculous allegation to make. Let me ask you, and I'm not supporting the allegation, but I'm still asking as a journalist, why do you think it's ridiculous? Why is it so silly that you can't believe there could be truth to it? After all, one of the world's most highly regarded papers that broke
well,
the Watergate story, the Washington Post, has carried it, and it's been given to them by Canadian officials who admittedly are not named. But the Washington Post has a reputation for accuracy and credibility. So let me just ask, I'm not supporting the allegation, but why do you so immediately, so
well,
instantly call it
first,
ridiculous?
first of all, I would not completely agree with you that whatever Washington Post says is credible and authenticated. These are all newspapers, however highly regarded, which completely support their government, especially on matters of foreign policy and security, etc., etc. So I'm not so much impressed by the fact that it is Washington Post which says these things. Anyway, if it is established at the end of an investigation in which both parties will have to join hands, if it comes out that yes, Mr. Amit Shah was indeed involved in this game, then certainly the Canadian allegations would stand vindicated.
Now, the Washington Post also says that Canada's national security advisor, as well as Canada's deputy foreign minister, met our national security advisor Ajit Doval for a secret meeting in Singapore on Saturday to share details about Amit Shah. The paper claims that Doval said to them, and I'm quoting, India would deny any link to the Niger murder and any link to any other violence in Canada, no matter what the evidence was. If he said that, and I'm not saying he did, but if he said that, what do you make of that end, no matter what the evidence was?
Well, Karan, I think these are all speculative things. I certainly don't know whether they met for 5 hours or 6 hours in Singapore. Our government hasn't said anything about that. And I don't know whether Mr. Doval has made any such statement. Yes, the Washington Post obviously has been fed by the Canadians. So they can feed Washington Post anything that they like. So one doesn't necessarily have to give credence everything that comes out in black and white.
Now, the New York Times, no longer the Washington Post, now I'm referring to the New York Times, that paper reports that the FBI cooperated with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to get evidence to support all of this. Should we in India be worried, A, by the American connection, and B, by the coordination that has apparently taken place between the United States and Canada?
Are you suggesting a trilateral coordinating effort? Trilateral, all three countries together, or each one bilaterally?
Well, as you know, India is cooperating with the Americans in terms
Right,
of the Panon allegations. In
right.
fact, as I said earlier, a team
Yeah,
has left for the United States today, both to brief the Americans on what is established, as well as to get an update from the Americans in terms of what new they found out. So we're
yeah.
cooperating with America. The Canadians allege, and I'm using the word allege, that India is not cooperating with them.
Well, they will say that for mainly, I think, domestic reasons. But I can't really offer any comment on that because our government is saying that the Canadians haven't provided a shred of evidence. And if there was a meeting in Singapore, I don't know anything about that meeting, and our government has said nothing about that meeting. So how can one comment on that? It's a one-sided story, and I'm unable to make any comments on that.
Are you saying, and I'm asking really for reasons of clarification, that when it's a one sided story, by which you mean one side is speaking, the other side is either denying or silent, when it's a one sided story, Indian citizens have no option but to believe their government? Is that your position? I'm asking for clarification.
No, all I'm saying is that Indian people in this particular case have no reason to doubt what their government is saying. And I have no particular reason to challenge government's version of this event. So I'm sure different people in India will take different positions. They'll come to their own different conclusions. But I think both India and Canada and other governments often use foreign policy issues for domestic reasons.
Can I put
Mr.
this to you?
Mr. Trudeau is doing that, and certainly our government has done it in the past on other matters, and they can do it on this one also. But as far as today is concerned, right now, I have no reason to disbelieve what our government is saying.
I hear what you're saying. Let me put this to you, Mr. Gharekhan. A paper that is highly respected in the world. You may not have the same opinion of the Washington Post, but it's undeniable that it is a very highly regarded paper in the world. When a paper like the Washington Post carries this story, and when the New York Times claims that the evidence has been jointly gathered with FBI help, and that means the American system has helped, it could end up influencing international opinion. Countries like the Five Eye countries, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, countries in Europe, all of them could begin to believe that there is some truth to the story. Does that worry you? That people will give credibility because it's the Washington Post carrying the story?
I agree with you, and this story is not good for us. Our government should make every effort and as early as possible to squash this story. Uh, I agree with you that India's prestige, India's honor, or India's credibility will suffer because of this story. But I think there is no but about it. But it is not a good thing for us. So what the government of India can do to counteract that, of course, our ambassadors and others will be going to their respective capitals and explain the story to them. They'll contact media in those countries and issue rebuttals and so that. But undoubtedly, this story is not good for us.
Tell me this. You're saying it is, and I'm quoting you, the government must make every effort to quash this story. You said it's India's honor, prestige, and credibility will suffer. Is it sufficient for ambassadors in Western capitals to meet the chancelleries there and refute and deny the story? Or do we need, at the highest level of government possible, either the foreign minister or the home minister or the prime minister, to publicly give interviews to papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and directly refute it? After all, the story now will be spread by papers. It's the damage those papers can do that we're talking about. Ambassadors visiting chancelleries may not affect the papers either way. But if the prime minister were to give an interview or the foreign minister were to give an interview, the Washington Post and the New York Times would be required to pick it up, and that would make news, and that would be a refutation. So is that the step necessary?
I think it is a good idea, Karan. I think we should consider that, the government should consider that, the foreign minister should consider writing an article, talking to the New York Times people in Delhi or Washington Post people in Delhi. I think we should not just leave this at a lower level, because it is a serious allegation, and it is now being made too much of by the Canadians for their own reasons. But I think on the whole, I would agree with you that it would be a good idea for a foreign minister to respond in any manner that he deems appropriate.
Now, at this point, Mr. Gharekhan, let's move and come to a second related issue. I'm talking now about the statement issued by the Ministry of External Affairs on Monday after Canada decided that the Indian High Commissioner and other diplomats are persons of interest in the Niger case. The statement issued by the MEA calls this, and I'm quoting, preposterous imputations and ascribes them to the political agenda of the Trudeau government that is centered around vote bank politics. The MEA statement suggests that Trudeau is doing this to win support from Canadian Sikhs with next year's Canadian elections in mind. Is that a fair charge in your eyes?
I will not rule it out at all. I think I have said more than once in this interview that the Canadian government, meaning the Prime Minister, has been reported to be in electoral trouble, is not very favorably placed. So it makes good sense to have this opinion that Canada, Mr. Trudeau, is using this for domestic political reasons. It makes absolute sense, no doubt about that.
Now, this MEA statement also makes some very personal charges against the Canadian Prime Minister. The MEA accuses Prime Minister Trudeau of hostility to India, of naked interference in Indian internal politics, of pandering to an anti-India separatist agenda. How do you, someone who's been one of the most senior ambassadors India has had, How do you view these very personal accusations against the Canadian Prime Minister?
Well, I think which is normally not done, but I think the guiding principle, it seems to me, of the government has been to make as tough, as strong a statement as possible. Indian people love their government taking a very strong position, and this is also directed at Indian public opinion. Because the strong language is not only made for Mr. Trudeau and his government, it is definitely also made for consumption at home, because the Indian public likes their government to stay tall and make tough and angry statements. So that is the domestic aspect to this, absolutely.
And does that justify the use of this sort of strong personal language?
Well, I, I would say that it was not so necessary to use that kind of language. But what I say is a kind of on an objective basis. But we are not dealing with an objective situation here. We are dealing with a situation which is very, very subjective for the government. And so the government, the stronger the statement from the government, the more the people will applaud that government.
Now, there is also in that MEA statement a specific accusation, this time against the Trudeau government rather than personally Prime Minister Trudeau himself. The MEA statement says, and again I'm quoting, it has consciously provided space to violent extremists and terrorists to harass, threaten, and intimidate Indian diplomats and community leaders in Canada. This has included death threats to them and to Indian leaders. All these activities have been justified in the name of freedom of speech. In this specific instance, to what extent is Canada guilty as charged?
I'm sorry, if I followed your question correctly, I think the Indian government is accusing the Canadian government of harassing Indian citizens and all that, right? Is that
Absolutely.
the
And also issuing death threats to them as well as
yeah.
to Indian leaders.
Well, I'm not sure of that. I think the government must have had some solid evidence to make that kind of statement. And maybe in the course of time, in the course of some investigation, all these facts, all these allegations or facts, if they are, will come out. So we we will not have answers to all these questions right now. We will have to wait for a while and see what happens. But I say once again that don't neglect or underrate the domestic factor in both countries.
I hear what you're saying, but you're also suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, that as yet we don't have or haven't seen the evidence that corroborates the claim that the Canadian government has provided space for violent extremists and terrorists to harass, threaten, and intimidate Indian diplomats, to issue them death threats.
No, but that is evidence.
You've muted yourself, sir. You've muted yourself.
Canada are openly waging a war against India for in the name of Khalistan. It's the established fact. They are there in Canada.
Let me ask you a very different question at this point, Mr. Gharekhan. What is true is that Khalistan supporting Canadian Sikhs are permitted to publicly display tableaus depicting the assassination of Indira Gandhi. And my question is simple. If the assassination of President Kennedy were to be depicted, would the Americans not be equally upset and offended?
I'm afraid I'm not following your bringing in Kennedy's name in this.
No, I'll explain the question again. I'm saying one of the things that has happened in Canada, about which the Canadian government is guilty because it's permitted it, is tableaus depicting the death and assassination of Indira Gandhi. If those tableaus were depicting the death of President Kennedy, not Indira Gandhi, wouldn't the Americans be equally upset?
Yes, they would. Yes. But I don't see any parallel in this particular situation because, but the fact still remains that Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards, and there was a kind of a fervor going on in the Punjab at that time. And from what I hear, what I'm told and read in newspapers, is that in Punjab itself, there is hardly any support for Khalistan.
Now, there's a second accusation in the MEA statement. I'd like to put that second accusation to you. The MEA statement says some individuals who have entered Canada illegally have been fast tracked for citizenship. It says multiple extradition requests from the government of India in respect of terrorists and organized crime leaders living in Canada have been disregarded. Do you believe Canada is guilty of deliberately disregarding Indian requests for extradition at the same time as fast tracking citizenship for people who've entered their country illegally?
Karan, there is no way that I can answer this question because I certainly don't have any access or any way to find out whether those allegations are true or not true or partially true. I have absolutely no way of making any observations on that one.
But here, you're no longer prepared to give the government the benefit of the doubt. Earlier, when we were talking about Amit Shah or other allegations made by the Washington Post against Indians, you firmly believed the government line. Now, on this specific issue, you say you don't know enough to say anything at all. So now you're not siding with the government.
No, because in the earlier one, they targeted a specific individual in the government of India. Now the ministry in its statement has made a general statement of those who are entering illegally or trying to enter illegally. That Canadians get. So it is a different, it's not a parallel situation.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
We're coming to the end of this interview, Mr. Gharekhan. Let me ask you two more questions. Everything with regard to Canada is, of course, connected to the Niger case or any other similar such alleged case of violence or killing in Canada. Up till now, however, what has been considered the more embarrassing story for India is not the Niger case, where we don't have many details, and I admit that, but the Panun case, which the American legal system has pursued. Yet, we've come up with a very, very strong statement against Canada. People say it's inconceivable that India would come up with an equally strong statement against America. Is that because Canada is perceived to be weak and we can get away with it? America is strong. We need their support. We need their friendship. We would never address America in these terms.
Well, that could be one factor, certainly, and it would be a valid factor. There is no need to be particularly consistent in foreign policy. But on the American, this particular question of Pandu in America, from what I believe and hear, is that the Americans and Indians are cooperating. Americans have provided evidence for that. which the Canadians have not so far. So yes, the factor is there that America is a very powerful country. We need Americans' help on various issues. So that factor is a valid factor to be taken into consideration. But equally important is the fact that the Americans are sharing or have shared whatever evidence they have before on making these allegations. So it's a complex picture which takes into account various types of factors.
Let me, in a sense, put the opposite of that question to you as well. The Americans have handled the Panun case with great discretion and delicacy. That's something the Canadians haven't done. Trudeau, for example, went public in the Canadian Parliament. In contrast, the Biden administration has been very restrained and silent in public. Do you think Washington needs to talk to Canada how to handle this sort of situation with greater sensitivity and sagacity?
Let us leave it to the Americans to guide or advise their colleagues and friends across the border. Let us not try to tell Americans what they should do or what they should or should not tell their Canadian partners. But you are right, as far as the Americans are concerned, they have been very discreet, very quiet. They have made their position very clear. They say that Indian sub-agency official was involved. They have said that. But the way Americans have reacted, because Americans, it is a two-way factor. America also needs India. It is not just India that needs America to be supportive on its side. Americans very much need India at this stage in the game. So there is a two-way traffic with the Americans.
My last question. There is no doubt that America considers Canada a very close ally. They're not just neighbors, the Americans are committed to defending and supporting Canada. Secondly, we now know that the American FBI has closely collaborated with the Canadian Mounted Police in providing evidence, analyzing that evidence. Therefore, is there a danger that India's strong accusatory rebuttal could also affect India-US relations? Is there a danger of that?
I don't think so. No, no. And I'm pretty sure that the Indian government has kept the American government in the picture. I'm quite positive about that, given our close relations with the Americans these days. So no, I don't think that is likely. I won't worry about that one.
All right, Mr. Gharekhan, I thank you for the time you've given me. I thank you for answering all my questions. And I'll end by repeating something that you said when I asked you about whether you were worried and concerned what impact stories in the Washington Post and papers like the New York Times could have. You said this story is not good for us. The government must make every effort to quash the story. India's honor, prestige, and credibility will suffer otherwise. And you suggested that rather than simply leave this to ambassadors to do in their respective countries, it might make sense for the foreign minister to step forward, write an article, or speak to a paper, give an interview, and himself lay the law on the line.
I agree. Yes, thank you. Yes, I concur with what you said.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gharekhan. Take care. Stay safe.
Nice talking to you, Karan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.